Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is T.L. Cowan, who is a writer, performer, activist, and a professor. She is currently at Yale as the Canadian Bicentennial Visiting Lecturer and Digital Humanities Fellow. Her academic work focuses on the cultural and intellectual economies and social lives of transfeminist and queer grassroots performance. Today, we'll talk with Professor Cowan about her research on feminist and queer cabaret. Welcome, Professor Cowan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You are welcome. It is delightful for us to have you here today. Your work is very interesting. Let's talk about the chapter you recently contributed to an anthology.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Okay, well, it's a very exciting anthology. It's edited by Alison Campbell and Stephen Ferrier, and it's called Queer Dramaturges, where performance leads queer. And it's an anthology that is I think one of my kind of most exciting contributions in terms of the milieu that I'm being published in, and so it's a collection of different perspectives on queer performance from really around the world, and it's one of the very, very, I think, rare collections that really does look at many different places in the world and where queer performance is happening. And so my chapter, which has a very long title, which is something like a hybrid present embodified, cabaret methods, and I think activist performance. And I'm looking at two performances in particular. The performance of Cesar Enriquez from Mexico City, and his performance is called Disertaciones de la Chingada, and the performance called Les Demi-Mondes, which is by Alexandra Tiglar, and who's from Toronto. And so my work is really an exploration of hemispheric performance studies, in particular on transgender feminist and queer cabaret performance. And by cabaret, I mean the kind of political, satirical, adult-oriented variety show. And so both Enriquez and Tiglar make political cabaret. And so the article, the chapter, is making an argument for the ways that cabaret performance seems to be a structure that's kind of uniquely conducive to critical citizenship, to political expression, and to bringing audiences around to the idea of social change.
So what led you to be interested in this topic?
Well, I guess first and foremost, I am a participant of these cabaret cultures, and so I have been a performer working in cabaret since the 1990s, and I've lived in a lot of different cities, and I've performed in a lot of different cities, and I have been an audience member of cabaret in a lot of different cities. And you know, really over the last 20 years, I have seen just such remarkable similarity in cabaret performance in different locales. So there's something very similar between the cabaret that's in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, New York, the Twin Cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Mexico City, and in particular I'm looking at North America. And so I have been working on this book project called Sliding Scale, which is on cabaret cultures, primarily in Montreal, New York, and Mexico City, but kind of more broadly across North America. And I guess my interest in the project is really to consider what is it about cabaret that is so compelling to so many of these kind of politically engaged feminist and queer performance artists, and also to the audiences. Like it remains an incredibly political, vibrant, popular form in these communities in ways that it's not in the mainstream. And so that's really what I'm kind of looking at when I'm studying cabaret.
Let's talk about some of the similarities.
Yes, of course. Okay, so really what you see a lot of is you see kind of structural similarities. So the variety show structure. You have a master of ceremony, or in the French we say conférencier, and you have this master of ceremonies that will kind of bring the audience together and introduce the theme of the show. And often the theme of the show has something to do with a kind of political theme. So it could be on kind of transgender awareness in feminist communities, for example, is something that a cabaret might be. And then you have lots of different kinds of performers. So someone might be doing a burlesque dance, someone might be doing stand-up comedy, someone might be doing spoken word performance, there might be some video, there might be someone playing piano, there could be some, you know, modern dance. And what happens is that there's a range of expertise. There's, you know, the performers range in age, and some of them are very, very polished performers, and some are very amateur. And the audiences are as diverse as what's happening on stage. And you also, one of the other really important similarities is the kind of media that is kind of attached to cabaret in feminist and queer communities. And so you see, you know, very similar kinds of posters, very similar kinds of really kind of under-resourced documentation. So it's an ephemeral form that doesn't have a lot of its own archives. And you also see the way that cabaret gets promoted is really through word of mouth, through posters in kind of community bookstores when those still existed, and you know, bars, coffee shops. People will hand around flyers. Oftentimes, cabarets will get promoted at big parties. So if you're doing a cabaret, you'll go to a party and you'll circulate at some other place. And even to the point of like these very ingenious ways that people promote their cabaret really deeply within a community is, for example, for the Meow Mix cabaret that a wonderful cabaret producer and curator, Myriam Genestier, what she would do when she was starting her first queer women's cabaret in Montreal in the early 1990s, she advertised it in the Women Seeking Women personal ads.
Oh, wow.
And so it's, you know, it's like, it's very much about, you know, what's happening on stage, what's happening in the audience, but also what's happening kind of broadly within the community, and how cabaret kind of brings that all together.
Here's a question. Do they ever use social media?
Oh my gosh, yes, of course, yes. And in fact, it's, I have to say that with the popularity of something like Facebook, you gain a lot. And in fact, Facebook has become the kind of de facto archive for a lot of these community-based ephemeral forms. And so that's really cool. So the Facebook page can stay up after the event, and people can upload their photos and things like that. And so that's really great. And you can invite thousands of people with one click, rather than, you know, 50 people with 50 flyers at a bar, you know?
It's much easier.
It's easier, but it also loses that kind of face-to-face intimacy of some of the previous ways of kind of mediating these cabarets. So it's super great. Facebook, for example, and Twitter are great for, you know, for promoting, but it has really transformed the way that cabaret functions within communities. Yeah.
Okay, one of the things you say that the cabaret is a translocal phenomenon.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that?
Okay, so
translocal.
You've heard of transnational, which is across countries. And the translocal is very similar and certainly related to the idea of the transnational, but the translocal references the multi-directional circulation of ideas and people between locations in ways that doesn't necessarily prioritize the nation or the national in the way that those bodies circulate. So it could be, translocal could be, for example, studying cabaret across Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, and Edmonton. So that's within a country, but I'm looking at how this form works in these multiple locations and really thinking about cabaret itself as the phenomenon that moves rather than people necessarily moving across those spaces. And so you think about the cabaret structure, so this variety structure that remains very much intact across these places, even though the performers themselves are not moving. Right. But then I also am looking at Mexico City, Montreal, and New York. And while each of those places have cabarets that differ slightly, the kinds of particularities and characteristics of the cabaret in each of those places has a lot to do with the cities that they're in, as well as the countries that they're in. And so talking about the translocal is a way to kind of nuance those kinds of characteristics and those particularities in a way that the transnational doesn't necessarily get at.
So you chose Mexico City and Toronto for the book chapter.
Exactly.
Why is that?
Because I saw these two performances, so César Enriquez's Dissertaciones de la Chingada and Alexandra Tiglar's Les Demi-Mondes, and I could not believe how their use of what I call a trans-temporal embodiment,
which means what?
one of those, you know, kind of incredibly dense phrases that I use in this article. But trans-temporal embodiment, what I'm talking about is the way that both Enriquez and Tiglar perform these figural figures, these mythological figures. Okay. So in the case of Enriquez, he's performing La Chingada, which is a very a kind of common and popularly used figure in Mexico to refer to the kind of feminized Mexicanness as the kind of emerges through colonialization in the face of Spanish colonialization, of colonization of Mexico. So you have La Chingada, and then you have the figure that Tiglar is performing, which is prostitution herself. And both of these performers talk about, I'm just going to say oppressive relations of power. So in Enriquez's case, he's talking about Spanish colonialism, U.S. imperialism, and narco-culture, particularly as a kind of ongoing way that Mexico is kind of being undermined and kind of experiencing violence at the hands of these different kind of formations of power. And the way that Tiglar talks about, she uses prostitution herself to look at the ways that the role of the sex worker has been used as a cultural trope in, you know, from everything from like La Traviata to the Police's Roxanne to Pretty Woman. So you have the image of the sex worker that gets used to build these kind of fictional narratives that become very kind of sensational and popular. And people get very famous, like Julia Roberts gets very famous for playing these roles, whereas people who are sex workers in real life remain criminalized, remain targets for police and other violence. And so both of these performers, having never seen each other, never heard about each other, are doing something very similar in the way that they're tracing these kind of political structures and experiences of negative relations of power, negative experiences of power through long histories on the stage, using humor, using kind of body dancing, using video, using, you know, all sorts of other things. Right. But they both do this.
Right, interesting. And, you know, part of what you write about is activism that comes out of cabaret. So let's talk about a couple of specific examples about that. Okay,
well, I mean, both of the performers that I talk about in this essay are really doing activist performance. And by activism, what I mean is sometimes it's very explicit. Like sometimes you'll have a performer get up on stage and do a political rant about an issue that's important to them. And so that's, one form of activism on stage in cabaret. But then you also have performances that are activist in a way that's like slightly more subtle. And what these performances do is they draw audiences' attention to political problem or issue, and kind of model a way, what they do is they model an analysis of this political issue or political problem in a way that allows us to think about the possibility for social change. And so, for example, just in the case of Alexandra Chiglar's piece, for example, one of the things that Les Demi-Mondes does by the end of the hour or so of this performance that has many different episodes in it, many different scenes or skits, by the end of that performance, the audience really thinks, oh, maybe I hadn't really thought about what it means to be criminalized as a sex worker and what it means to have the thing that you're doing as work be also making you a target for incarceration and other kinds of legal procedures. And so then in Canada, for example, that kind of activism created an opportunity for a kind of popular understanding of the importance of decriminalizing sex work. And so in Canada, sex work was decriminalized and then recriminalized.
Really? Okay.
But this kind of work, not only just it's activist in the way that it builds builds an understanding across audiences. And then, if you were to see that show, for example, you might go home and say to your partner or to your mother, I saw this performance and I never really thought about this, but I'm going to think about it some more. Right. And so I think that's really the way that cabaret functions in an activist way. And there's a famous line from Friedrich Hollander, who is a great cabaretist from the Weimar era of Germany, and he talks about the cabaret functioning in a political way as serving you a poison cookie. So you'll be watching this kind of innocuous performance. It's entertaining. You're laughing, maybe. And you're not really thinking that you're being taught something, that you're being asked to think, and then all of a sudden there'll be some kind of, he talks about a political chanson, or there'll be some element that kind of gets you thinking, and then you don't even really realize that it's happened until 3 days later when you think, oh, I think I digested something that made me think, you know?
Right,
and so that's the way that I think cabaret functions as activism.
Okay, so what do you conclude in your piece?
I guess I conclude just that first of all, I think cabaret gets undermined as a cultural formation because it's often very amateur, and it happens not in grand theaters, but in bookstores and in, kind of like home basements and backyards, but yet it's doing some very important cultural work, and that it does create possibilities for social change and for thinking about the possibilities for social change. So rather than thinking that things always have to be the way they are, cabaret allows us to kind of imagine or hope for a shifting in the way things are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much,
and sharing some
Marilyn.
of your research.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Cowan and her work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.